Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I am so pleased to be able to be interviewing Tina Shermer Sellers. Am I saying that correct?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Well, she is the author of a new book called Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy. And I'm so excited about this topic for a variety of reasons. One is that I work with this topic a lot as well. Secondly, I know that you're a supervisor of sex therapists, and we tend to share some supervisees sometimes. And so I've heard about you for a long time, so I'm excited to get to know you better. And I just think that this is such an interesting topic to discuss from different lenses. So you do not come from a Mormon background. And so it'll be interesting to see how these types of messages and issues kind of run the course through all different types of, especially, we're probably going to be talking mostly from Christian perspectives, but all kinds of religiously conservative perspectives. And I just think it's such a prevalent issue that it hopefully will be really applicable for most of the listeners listening. So welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and I had a chance to hear you present at the last ASECT conference, the sex therapy conference for sexual educators and therapists this summer, and you spoke about this topic, and it was an excellent presentation. You spoke with my colleague, Kristen Hodson. You're going to be speaking again just this coming weekend on Saturday, I believe. So can you tell us a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit and what you'll be doing there and how we can help people encourage them to go?
I'm excited about the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. They've been great in the past. This year, we'll be focusing in a variety of areas, but I think there are areas that people, both practitioners and parents and people in the public, are generally concerned about. So we'll be looking at pornography and how you work with people around that issue, and how, I think, as parents and people in the public, how you deal with that issue, which I think will be really important. We'll be talking about sex education, where we are with that, how we can improve around sex education with Al Vernecchio, who's a phenomenal sex educator, and he has many TED Talks, and that will be fabulous. And then I'll be looking at sexual shame, and that will be, I think, a really useful thing. We have learned some really important things about how sexual shame interrupts our ability to do attachment and intimacy well, and that is at the core of our happiness. So I'll be talking about what in our history and in our life has caused sexual shame, and religion, and the way that we have constructed conservative religion at the power level has affected that. And in the last 30 years, that has involved our sociopolitics as well. So I'll spend a little bit of time looking at that a little bit from a historical lens, but then really quickly get down into what that really looks like in our lives and how that manifests itself, because it's very subtle and yet profoundly powerful. So I'll really take time to put skin on that so people can see how that manifests in people's lives. And then I'll talk about an evidence-based healing approach that I developed that really helps people heal from that. And then a little bit about, I have in the book, touch and non-touch practices that people can employ to further heal. So that's a little bit about what I'll do at the summit. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
That's going to be phenomenal. And I'm so excited for that to be happening. And I'll be there as well as an attendee. So I'm very excited to see you again in person.
Yeah.
So let's start with a little bit. I think what I would really like to spend a little bit of time on is your history. You speak a little bit about it in your presentations and also on your website. I just am fascinated by, the types of happenings that occurred in your life to kind of get you to this point where I believe you teach at a religiously affiliated university, and and how this topic has come up a lot, and not only in your practice, but also with your supervisees and just the work that you've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been teaching at Seattle Pacific University since 1991. And that whole time, I've done various things. In fact, the bulk of my job there in the Department of Marriage and Family Therapy has been the director of the medical family therapy program. So a lot of my career is actually spent in medicine, preparing marriage and family therapists to work in outpatient medical settings. But the entire time that I have been at SPU, I've been teaching the graduate human sexuality course for marriage and family therapists, which is a required course for licensure in the state of Washington. It's been one of my favorite courses. I had the good fortune of growing up in a Swedish immigrant home, and everyone, literally everyone in my family was very comfortable around the topic of sexuality. And I had hundreds and hundreds probably of conversations about sexuality with both my grandparents, with aunts and uncles, with both of my parents. And I thought every family was like that, honestly, until I was in my 30s. And so to me, everyone had bodies and sexuality was a part of life, and people were comfortable talking about it, and you got to learn about it as you were growing up in really age-appropriate ways. And, you talked about it like you talked about brushing your teeth and what you were having for dinner, and it wasn't made more important or less important. It was a very important and special part of your life, but it wasn't punctuated in such ways that it was hush-hush. I just thought it was natural and normal and important. But it fit right in with all the other natural, normal, and important parts of life. So when I came to SPU, I had come from being a junior high and high school teacher where I also taught math, science, and Latin, believe it or not. And in my science courses, I taught sexuality as well. And then when I came to SPU to teach, I was asked if I wanted to teach the sexuality class. And I was like, well, of course, that'd be fabulous. So I taught that forever. Well, as a part of my course, I have the students write their sexual autobiographies. Now, in our program, we have our students reflect on their life story from multiple perspectives in multiple courses. And the reason we do this is we believe that you're only ever as good a therapist as you know what your own story is. So if you're taking a family of origin course, for example, you might write about aspects of your family of origin story. When you're taking my psychopharmacology and medical issues course, you're going to be asked to write your illness story. Well, in the human sexuality course, you are asked to reflect on your sexual autobiography. And I give the students about 70 or so questions that guide them through 3 generations of thinking about affection and gender stories, and walks them through how they learned about sexuality and their experiences, all the way through thinking through the past, thinking about their parents, thinking about their own childhood, their adolescence, and their young adulthood. And so I've read well over 500 of these in my career. Well, in the early 2000s, I began to notice a significant shift in the tone and expression of the sexual autobiographies of my students. Now, the university that I teach in is religiously affiliated. However, at the graduate level, you don't need to have a religious orientation to come to the school. You don't in general anyway, but especially at the graduate level, people come because the program is accredited, it's nationally recognized, it's a very, very strong program. And so we maybe have half of our students that have a religious orientation. We have many people that come from the BYU program, in fact, that come to our program. So we might have, half our students, maybe a little bit more or less, depending on the year, that have a religious background, many that do not. Yet in the year 2000, I began to notice that my students, both from religious and non-religious backgrounds, began to show significant increases in sexual shame in how they told their stories. So they would describe levels of humiliation and disgust towards their body and their identity as a sexual person, how they thought about their story and their own feelings of sort of unworthiness when they would talk about their experiences and how they unfolded, like when kissing began or when they fell in love with somebody, how things unfolded. They would describe these things with just an enormous amount of shame. And then all kinds of distrust came out as they would tell their story, and body hatred. And I didn't really understand. There was also a significant amount of ignorance with regard to what was happening with their body, their development with the other, whether it was someone of the same sex or opposite sex. And I was trying to figure out what exactly was happening and why there was this shift in feeling so badly about themselves and how their development was unfolding. So I began to ask questions, and it took a couple of years to really begin to piece together what had happened. And for my students that had come from conservative Christian backgrounds, what I discovered was I was hitting the first wave of students that had come from what we later called the purity movement in the evangelical movement. And this was a movement that started in the early 90s out of a program that was called True Love Waits out of the Southern Baptist Church. And it spread like wildfire across the United States and went actually beyond just the evangelical movement and into many other, some Catholic churches, some other churches.
Well, I think even including affecting sexual education in the public school system in many of these geographical areas.
Right. So then beyond that, also in the early 80s, we began the abstinence only education, quote unquote, education programs where we started pumping millions and millions of dollars. It began in 1981 with $6 million. And I think the last year that money was requested for abstinence only education in 2005, Bush requested $273 million that year. No, he didn't get all of that. But that's how much it increased through 2 Bush administrations and 1 Clinton administration.
See, and this is really interesting. Let me just pause for a minute because I think it just kind of goes against what you think would be common, quote unquote, common sense. Like we think, oh, we just have always been a sexually oppressive culture or nation or, people going back millennia, and we've slowly been improving. But what you're really saying is that there was a retrenchment that happened in the 80s and 90s that in other words, sex abstinence education was not the only thing that was available prior to the 80s. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I'm a child of that, both in what was happening in the Christian church, as well as what was happening in the public schools. So in the 60s and 70s, you had really this opening up that happened as a pushback from the 50s. You had second wave feminism. In the public sector, you had a lot of people speaking out and wanting voice and wanting change with regard to who could do what and how you could do things. And you had much more sex education going on in the public schools, and you had much more sex research going on in the 70s, things that we still aren't back to doing yet as far as research goes. We had research going on for the disabled that we still aren't doing in the sexuality research. We aren't back to doing that we were doing in the 70s. Much more research. And then in the early 80s, we had, which will often happen, and if you take about a 10,000 foot level, you'll see that we've done this kind of, you watch things open up, and then you watch this huge clampdown. So in the early 80s, we began a huge clampdown, and it was in response to the second wave feminist movement, in response to an economic downturn, and then further in response to AIDS. And what was actually also happening behind the scenes, which I think was actually more powerful, it was the joining of the religious right and the moral majority that were merging in support of the huge consumerism movement that was happening. So it was very money driven in driving capitalism. And this is very, very well recorded. There's an excellent book that I encourage everyone to read if they want to know what was happening in the early 80s and through the 90s before actually most of the rest of us became aware of what was happening, called Sex, God, and Mom by Frank Schaeffer. And he was actually a part of this movement, the Koch brothers joining with all the religious right, because his father, Francis Schaeffer, was a part of this on the evangelical religious right side. And when he became a grandfather, he was so convicted about his involvement in this in his younger days that he sat and started writing books about what was really happening, who was really in those meetings, and what was happening actually. And when I read that book, it explained for me how we got to a place where my students were experiencing what they were experiencing in their youth groups beginning in the 90s, because I didn't understand it, because I had such a different experience in the Jesus movement in the 70s, which was rock and roll concerts and, Jesus was going to make your life make sense, because he was a radical that stood up for love and justice and standing up for the least among us. And we had made this radical turn into controlling people's lives in ways that didn't give them choice anymore.
So fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just did an interview with Dr. Roger Libby about sexual revolutions, and so you're seconding and even going further into detail some of the things that he was talking about.
Yeah.
Great. So you notice this in your students, you start going, what's going on? you start doing some research, and what comes from all of this? Didn't you start a project that helps tell some of these stories? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, honestly, it broke my heart. I spent the first several years as I was reading these sexual autobiographies and how they were changing, crying in my chair's office. I mean, the stories were absolutely heartbreaking because it was profoundly interrupting people's ability to love, to receive love, and to give love. And people were telling stories of getting married and not being able to consummate their marriages. I mean, they had such sexual dysfunction. And I had not seen this in my career with young people. I mean, I had young men with erectile dysfunction. I had young women with vaginismus and other pelvic pain disorders. I had not seen this. And so we're talking really extreme, both physical manifestations and emotional manifestations. So this was not a small issue. This was really big. And so it literally broke my heart. So I began to ask the question, did Christianity ever get sexuality right? Did it ever develop a Christian sexual ethic based in love and in justice and in grace? Did it ever do that? Or has it been one that's been about don't and silence and discounting or sort of defaming the body always? I didn't know the answer to that question. So I gathered up grad assistants and said, let's explore this question. Let's go back in history and see what we find, because I want to know if we ever got it right. And if we didn't, then I want to keep going back on the Abrahamic line and see then if the Hebrew people ever got it right. Because I believe that God made our bodies on purpose, and our bodies and our hearts and our minds and our souls seem to be hell-bent on connection and pleasure. Like, we are driven for intimacy. You watch it the moment that a baby is born, he or she is just immediately rooting, wanting that breast, wanting connection, wanting that skin-to-skin closeness, and the milk doesn't come down for a few days. We know that with little infants and toddlers, if they don't get enough touch, that they'll suffer neurological damage. And if you walk down the halls of an Alzheimer's unit, you will find people who, not only if they don't have memory, and yet they will still be seeking connection and pleasure. So I believe we're hardwired for it, and our bodies are clearly seeking connection and pleasure. Like, we have 5 senses that tell us so much about the beauty and wonder of the world that we live in. And then I love talking about the clitoris because the only purpose that it has is to bring pleasure to women. So
Right?
I
Like,
think,
what a wonderful divine message that is.
oh, I know, right? So I think that there's a lot of intention here. So I thought, somewhere, there's got to be somewhere on that Abrahamic, sort of monotheistic line where there's some communication with God's people that sexuality and sex is good. And it's through this that I want you to know that you are beloved. And I'm Swedish, so Swedes are known for being stubborn, and I got an extra dose of it from my family, I'm sure of it. So I said, let's see if we can find out the story here. And so we did. We just started studying, and we went back through history, and we actually could not find any place where Christianity really had gotten it right. But what we did then is discover the story of how Christianity developed this idea that of the mind-body split, that the spirit and the mind are really revered, and the body is seen as something that is going to take you away from God. And I don't know if you want me to share that here, but it makes a whole lot of sense when you see it and how it unfolded historically. It's very patriarchal, and it just makes a lot of sense. It's kind of how things unfold, but it's been there all along. And but
I would love for you to go into this. Is this is this like the vow of Ona type of slide Okay, well,
I can certainly talk about that. No, but
let's do both then.
Hebrew, so that's when I get into the Hebrew stuff.
Okay.
But so what happened was that earlier, before Jesus' time, in about 300 BC, the philosophers Aristotle and Plato, they were really the ones that originated the mind-body split, where the body was seen as beautiful, but the mind was really seen as that which was going to help us understand. That was really our ticket. And the mind was really elevated as the important part of ourselves. And the body brought beauty, but wasn't the more important part of us. So that was the beginning of the mind-body split. And of course, this was really part of patriarchy. It was part of what the men could do. So this was in place in society, in the elite, for about 300 years before Jesus came along. And so patriarchy and the mind-body split is well established. And then Jesus comes along, and that gets going. And then as Christianity begins to form, Christianity is attempting to separate itself from Judaism as its own separate religion, separate type of thought. And it goes along, and it's like any religion, it's bumpy and things are difficult. It's being persecuted and whatnot. And so it goes through its first few hundred years. And at about 400, Constantine, who's the emperor, becomes a Christian. So he then has the power to appoint who will become now the leaders of this young church. So around this time, of course, all of the people who are trying to get this church established, they're all men. There's women too, but the men are really the ones that are getting listened to, I think, because it's a patriarchal culture. The men are trying to establish themselves in part by how they can dismiss and repress the body. So they are all basically short of torturing the body. And the ones that can do this the best, the ones that can deny the body the best, are seen as the most spiritual. And this becomes a way in which spirituality, or the most spiritual, is established. Those that can deny the body and lean into their spirituality. So this is what establishes the spirit-body split in the church. And when men fail in this spirit-body kind of demonstration, they used women to blame their failings, which we still see in culture.
Brilliant.
So like if a woman is raped, we say, well, were you drinking? What were you wearing? Right? This has been a part of our story for millennia. This idea that the body is what takes us away. Now, in American culture, we have gone along with this mind-body split because we have built an entire economy on the mind-body split. We pay no attention to the effect that we use bodies to run our economy, and we pay no attention to the effect of that on relationships and on people. And yet it has a profound effect on relationships and people. Objectifying people and people objectifying themselves, in Peggy Ornstein's book, Girls and Sex, shows the effect of that on us. I mean, the ways that it affects men and the ways that it affects girls and their sense of efficacy is just phenomenal. And yet this is the way we run our country. So anyway, this has been around forever. And so as I saw that, I thought, okay, well, that makes sense. That's exactly what happened. We never said, what does it look like to actually really, truly build a sexual ethic based on the values and lifestyle that was demonstrated by Jesus, who was God incarnate, right? So, well, then did the Jewish people have anything to give us? And so that's when I got into all of the things that I could find in Hebrew writing. And I found a ton of beautiful, beautiful stories that I had no idea were there, stories that I wished people had seen growing up. And that's where, you heard me talk about the vow of Ona, which is an entire set of guidelines that you can run your marriage on, you could raise your children by, that are all sex positive. They're beautiful.
Can we go into some of those?
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I'll probably talk about these when I'm in at the Sex Summit too. So these vows are taken by, and they're still taught today in Hebrew schools, in Hebrew boys schools. They're taken when a man gets married. Some of these also come from fertility guidelines as well. The purpose of all sexual touch is to reinforce the loving bond over the lifespan. The idea that the elderly are not sexual is actually a foreign concept in the Torah. So you grow up knowing that your grandparents are sexual. That is just a known fact. You grow up knowing that your parents are sexual. And in fact, if you talk to most people who grow up in a healthy Orthodox Jewish home, they will probably tell you, if you ask them, that their parents slipped away on the Sabbath and made love, because it's a double blessing to make love on the Sabbath. So kids grow up knowing that their parents are blessing their marriage, are working on their marriage, are sexual with each other, which we know from research is a very healthy thing for kids to know. Another one is sex is not considered shameful, sinful, or obscene. Sexual enjoyment is recommended for times when procreation is impossible. Another one is sex is considered a woman's right and not a man's. He is to make sure she experiences pleasure and joy each time they touch. Now, this is people always gasp when they hear this because it's so counter-Western intuitive and countercultural. We do the exact opposite in Western culture, but this is brilliant. And it's brilliant because if you raised a boy to pay attention to other, it actually helps him work on something that might not be natural for him. Often in the sort of natural tendencies in boys, they're competitive. You give 2 4-year-olds a stick, they turn them into lasers and swords, and they want to compete. That's a natural tendency. That's a really lovely, wonderful tendency in men. We probably wouldn't have survived as long if men weren't that way. But when it comes to relationships, that tendency can get them in trouble because they might become too self-focused. So if you raise a boy to pay attention to other relationally, then they're much more likely to be a better lover earlier on. What happens when we don't teach that is that we have to wait for men to get to midlife before they begin to notice that what really grounded all that hard work that they did in their life, in their career, was their relationships with their children, their relationships to their partner. And men will naturally come to that, but often it won't happen till midlife. With women, if they grow up knowing from their family that it needs to be about them, that the focus needs to be about them, that they need to be treated with love and respect, that they need to be cherished, that they need to know what their pleasure is, what their preferences are, and that that's the way that they're to be treated, then she is going to value that more. She's going to pay more attention to that. She's going to have much higher standards around how she is treated, and she's going to have much more voice about what she wants and what she doesn't want. Well, women can have a natural tendency to pay attention to other, and we know that we socialize girls to do that too. Well, if she's raised with this other idea, then we're helping her to grow her growing edge sooner. So rather than wait till her midlife, when she finally begins to say, wait a minute, what about me here? I want to do this, this, and this. I think this, and this. No, this is not okay with me. Now, much earlier on, she's beginning to have voice for herself. She's beginning to claim what's okay with her. She's really not putting up with things that aren't okay with her. So we have a much better chance that our young people are picking partners that are better choices for them, and that they're able to have deeper intimacy sooner in their life. These vows, these guidelines are thousands of years old, and the Hebrew people had this figured out for a long time. And, I just discovered these, like, I don't know, 6-7 years ago when I was writing the book. And I was like, oh my goodness, these are so wonderful. So that's one. Another one.
These are wonderful, by the way. You're doing great.
Sex and sexuality are not seen as primarily about intercourse. All forms of loving touch that are about connection and pleasure, that are about these other guidelines, are valued. Anything that bonds you is great. Sexual touch is meant to be celebrated in joy, not in sadness, anger, disinterest, self-interest, or when drunk. Sex for selfish or personal satisfaction without regard for your partner is considered wrong or evil. And this word evil is very rarely used in the Torah, so this is a very strong statement. Man is never to coerce or force his partner to be sexual through emotional or physical tactics. This to me is super important because it's all about consent. And we know in our culture that we have messed up consent so much that men, boys, don't even know when they're getting consent. Like, is it consent if she's drunk or not? And she says yes. Like, this to me is so important, this one. And yet again, it's thousands of years old. I mean, and I think, gosh, they've been raising their boys to know this. Sex is not to be used as a weapon against a partner, either by depriving or compelling sex. It is considered a serious offense to use sex in any way to manipulate or punish one's partner. Sex involves the root word to know, meaning to know the whole person, the heart, mind, soul, and body. The Jewish understanding was that lovers prepared to love each other with the same intention as the rabbis preparing to enter the Holy of Holies, to commune with God. They understood the sacredness. To enter lovemaking in a cavalier way was to turn desire into dust. Now, I see that in my office all the time. People that just, don't even think about how and when they're going to make love to each other. And someone got bored about 15 years ago, and their desire has turned to dust, and that's because their sex life is so boring. Someone's not been having a good time for a long time. Well, they're not preparing. They're not thoughtful. They're not mindful. They're not really even there. And I think this guideline really attends to that. All forms, I think I read that one. All forms of sexual touch are recognized and valued and permissible as long as both partners desire it. So anything's okay as long as your both up for it. So that's the Valvona and some fertility guidelines that I sort of put all together. And I think these and you can raise your children by these, and you can run your relationship by these, and they're all sex positive. None of them are don't and no and hush and stop and give you nothing. All of these are filled with things you can build on.
Yeah, and none of them necessitate really going against what I would consider basic Christian values.
Oh, no.
In other words, we don't need to worry about, taking a sex positive approach will somehow demean my values or what I think, I should be doing, like you're saying, as a spiritual person. In fact, it's going to help your spirituality. It's going to help your sense of self. I like the Jesus movement you're talking about in the 70s. That sounds really wonderful and accepting and edifying, right? Which when you think about spirituality, hopefully it is something edifying.
Right.
When you think about sexuality, you want it to be something edifying.
Absolutely. Well, and to me, I always come back to, is it based in love and justice and grace? Like you should be able to see those things in it. Otherwise, it can't be about God. And I look at these things and I think, oh, can you be loving each other in these? Is there justice in these? Is there mutuality in these? Absolutely. This is going to support a relationship. This is going to help people build intimacy and connection and pleasure. And can they experience God in the center of them, inside, honoring each other this way? Oh, I believe absolutely. So to me, these resonated when I read them. I thought, oh, these are lovely.
Can we spend a little bit of time maybe moving back to a slide that I thought was so important, and this idea of just naming sexual shame. So in other words, I believe it was one of your students who came up with an operational definition for sexual shame.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that process, and maybe I can even read it for you, or if you want to read it,
sure.
That would be, I think, really helpful. So that I think it's important sometimes to define what we're talking about, that we're trying to get past.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, this was a doctoral student who graduated this last year, Dr. Noelle Clark. And she actually came to me a few years ago and had been studying my work. And she said, I really want to do my doctoral dissertation on religious sexual shame. But when I got into the literature, what I realized is we had never actually, through research, defined an operational definition for sexual shame. And so I'm going to need to start there. And I said, great, start there, because if we haven't done it, we need one. And I said, and then you can build your career on religious sexual shame, because you know as well as I do that we need the research underneath it. It's sometimes hard to get because it's hard to get religious people to talk, but we need it because we see the effects. And so she did her research through a qualitative methodology and interviewed people to come up with an operational definition for sexual shame. She actually won the President's Citation Award for her research. It was so brilliant. The definition she came up with through data crunching all of her interviews just ran so true to my experience of what I've seen in my office and through my students' lives. It's been really wonderful to have it kind of in black and white in front of me. So the definition reads this way: sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture and society, and subsequent critical self-appraisal. So that creates a continuous feedback loop. In other words, you're criticizing yourself inside, and then you feel criticized on the outside, or the criticism happens on the outside and then it moves back inside between people. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment toward one's own sexual desire. If you read Peggy Ornstein's book, Girls and Sex, the entire thing, but I think where it really exploded for me was when I got to the last chapter. And you see, so she interviewed 70 girls ages 15 to 20. When you see how girls have no idea how to protect themselves in sexually risky situations, you understand how deep the sexual shame runs and how devastating it is to not provide comprehensive sexual education and then to raise girls to objectify themselves and then put them in college where they have no idea and believe that they have no right to protect themselves. In fact, that they should not protect themselves. It is so stunning. It just is heartbreaking and takes your breath away. I now am telling everybody, you need to read this book whether you have kids or not, because we need to understand what is happening here with our boys and our girls. And maybe that will motivate people to start standing up for our need to provide sex education, beginning at age and in the home and then beginning in school as soon as they get in school, because we have to make this a normal part of people's experience.
Well, I agree that that's an incredibly powerful definition and also fits extremely well my 20 plus year experience of working with primarily sexual shame and religious shame issues. So I think that that's an incredibly powerful thing to now have in writing that so many of us can turn to. It's one thing to anecdotally say, well, yes, this is my experience. It's a whole nother thing to say this is an evidence-based, kind of systemically approved or proven concept that is very much affecting people's lives. I guess I'd like to spend, our last few minutes here giving you a chance to maybe offer just a few, 2 or 3 concrete, quantifiable types of options that people can consider if they're feeling like, what, this is really powerful to listen to. I relate to a lot of what she's saying. I can understand how this has had an impact in my life. It's kind of the first step, right? Is realization, self-awareness. But now what? So now what do I do with that? What do I do with that realization? And I'm just wondering what, we could spend 10 hours talking about this, but what maybe are some concrete things that you could offer from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, I feel like shame and sexual shame really can bind people and give them that sense I don't know how to celebrate this aspect of myself and to connect with another. I don't know how to feel that I deserve this or can have this. And I don't know how to heal. I have no idea how to heal. It feels monumental to heal. And that was part of why I wrote the book. Is I wanted to understand what happened historically. And then I wanted to find the hope for people that the church was never meant to be sex positive. It was always meant to be, or it's never meant to be sex negative. It was always meant to be sex positive. And here's the proof. Here's the proof that it was meant to be sex positive. I have story after story that God was relentlessly trying to show us that this is a wonderful part of us, that God wants to love us through our sexuality and so many other parts of life, but definitely also through our sexuality. And we have so many concrete stories and concrete ways to do that. Here is the evidence. And then there is a model for how to heal. And so the book is really put together in a way that is very practical, so people can actually take the book and do a book group with it if they want to. They can read it themselves. They can take it to their therapist if their therapist isn't understanding them, or why their faith is so important to them and they still are involved in their faith, but their faith was also a part of hurting them. But they're not leaving. They just, want their therapist to understand that parts of it weren't helpful. So they can give, because some therapists are like, want them to kind of leave it all, like throw the baby out with the bathwater. So this book is actually written for therapists too, to understand, like, this is the story here. So the book has a model called Frame, Name, Claim, and Aim. And it's the model for erasing sexual shame. And what I like about that is I call it the mess. It's the model to help clean up the mess of sexual shame. Frame is that you need to get yourself good, solid sex education. And that is really what's going to give you the scaffolding to heal. It's going to fill in the blanks of what you don't understand. It's going to erase the mythology of the inaccurate information you've been given, because you've been given a lot of inaccurate information through media and maybe through schooling. We found out that 80% of the information given through abstinence-only education was incorrect. 80%.
Goodness grief.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There was the sex education from 1981 to 2005 was studied, and 80% was incorrect. So you need a frame of education, and then you need to name your story. You need to tell your story. And that's where finding a tribe of people where you can provide for each other compassion and empathy and good listening, and finding out you're not alone, that you together, all of you didn't have the support you needed. And by not having support and not having accurate information and getting inaccurate information and being in a place of silence, this was really hard. And so having your story heard in love helps the shame begin to drip off of you. And then claim is a process of beginning to claim your body as a good, wonderful thing, and not this baloney that we are given by culture that it's not good enough because it doesn't look right, or it's not this or not that or whatever, but that your body is good no matter what, because it allows you to stay here and to give love and to receive love. And we have to work hard to claim it and to love it. And we need to do that in community. And we all have to work really hard at that. So there's ideas on how to do that in the book. And then in the process of doing these three things, we begin to write a new sexual legacy. And that sets us free. This is really where the truth sets us free, as we do these four things together. So I talk about that in the book. So the book is a real tangible thing you can use in reading it and reading it together with people. So that was really why I did it, is I wanted to give people something that would set them free. So, and it was what people were asking me for, and I'm like, okay, I'm writing it, I promise, I'll get it to you. So
yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome. That's so needed. We need resources like that in our libraries, in our fingers. So much of the work that I do and so many of our colleagues are doing is about sexual education, the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. It's just so important. And it is, it's so interesting, because I think in general, people might think of sex as this kind of frivolous thing on the sidelines, like sex, who cares? What's the big deal? Why would it be such a big part of mental health or an ability to have a quality of life? And yet we know it is so integral. And I'm so glad you brought up this concept of, people and their relationships with their religions. And we do tend to take polarized views. It's either all good or all bad. And most of our relationships with our families, with our country, with our cultures, with our religions, if we took that approach, we wouldn't be able to belong to anything. Exactly. So, all of these things help us and hurt us. And it's this idea of, how do I navigate these things best, that in a way that fits me and my circumstances best. And And with the added understanding that sexuality is not something frivolous on the sidelines, like you described so well, especially coming from a Christian or believing type of framework, that if you're going to believe in a God that created us, well, sexuality was a huge integral piece of that creation, and how important it is to recognize that and not see it as some frivolous, either animalistic or natural man type of entity that doesn't deserve our energy and our mindfulness, like you so well described. So I can't thank you enough for coming on. These are beautiful things that you've shared with us. I know you have so much more to share. Please, if you're in the area in Salt Lake City, consider going to this summit. It's a very unique opportunity, especially geographically speaking. Unfortunately, some of these types of seminars are mostly available on the east or west coasts of our country. And so to have something in the Rocky Mountain area like this, where people like Tina and Al Vernacchio and Dr. Klein and some of the others who will be presenting is a very unique, sex-positive, richly educating experience that I think would be sad for people to miss. So I'm very excited to see you in a few days, and I wish you well with all your endeavors. And if you'd like to leave us with some closing thoughts, I'd love to hear from you.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to be with you, Natasha. And I wish all your listeners well and encourage them to just keep working for connection and pleasure and deep intimacy in their life, because I just believe that God wants to love you through it. So all the best to you and to your listeners.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until till we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.